Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Module 6. This is Part 2. In this section, we're going to be focusing on the institution of slavery from the master's end of things, the kinds of arguments that they're making to try to defend this institution. Now, I think despite our popular perceptions, most white Southerners actually didn't own slaves. And you can kind of get a sense of that here in the chart. You can see that the vast majority of Southern whites, even as late as 1860, actually didn't own slaves at all. There's only about a quarter of Southern whites who owned any slaves, and only a very small fraction of them, about 2% of that 25%, so a very small number of people, actually owned large numbers of slaves. And the threshold that historians have typically pointed to was 20 or more slaves to designate someone as a very large slave owner. So these very large slave owners are pretty uncommon. And I think this raises an important question for us. Given that so few whites actually owned slaves, why did so many of them support the institution of slavery? Because they did. I think certainly economics is a big part of this. Whether they're wealthy or not, all whites have a stake in a slave society. Economically, owning slaves gives them a better chance at economic success. And they can see this. They can look around at their communities and they see that their neighbors who are slave owners are more successful. Their farms are more productive. They're making more money. It's tangible. So many whites who don't own slaves at the moment aspire to move into the ranks of the slaveholding class because they believe that will help make them more successful. There's also a lot of non-slave owners who are profiting from slavery even if they don't actually own slaves themselves. Many of these non-slave owning whites were growing crops, things like wheat or other food crops, or raising animals like hogs that they would then sell to plantation owners. They're essentially making their money off of supplying slave owners. They may not own slaves themselves directly, but they're providing the crops that are feeding that slave population so that plantation owners can devote most of their focus to cash crop production. So they're profiting off of slavery as a supplier, just not necessarily as an owner. So for many of these non-slave owning Southern whites, they have very little incentive or desire to get rid of slavery because they see that as the path to wealth and power. And for many of them, that's what they aspire to. They want to move into those ranks themselves. There's also notions of racial superiority. This idea that in this kind of a slave society, all whites are elevated above blacks. So no matter how poor they are, white men are guaranteed certain rights and privileges simply because they're white. This racial identity is also binding whites together in support of slavery. We start to see new racial theories in the 1830s being articulated to try to support whites' notions of superiority. Now, before this point, when Southerners defended slavery, they tended to characterize it as a necessary evil. This was the idea that was in vogue around the time of the American Revolution up into the 1820s. This was the argument that people like Jefferson and others made, that slavery was not a good thing, that it was an evil. But they believed that it was so crucial to the economy at the time that they couldn't easily do away with it. But they did recognize that it was not a positive thing, and they expected that it would die out on its own over time. So they expected that slavery would slowly kind of phase itself out. So in a sense here, they believed that it was a practice that the South was kind of stuck with for the moment, but that it would eventually go away. And you see this quote here by Jefferson referring to slavery. And he says, "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." Recognizing that slavery was not a good thing. That's something they believed was necessary at the time. Well, that was then. By the 1830s, slavery is still the key to the South's economy, even though it's mostly ended in the North. By this point in time, abolitionists are becoming much more vocal in their criticisms of slavery and much more vocal in speaking out about the evils of slavery. And in this context, Southerners are growing a lot more defensive. In the 1830s, Southerners start making a much more aggressive defense of slavery, not as a necessary evil, But increasingly, they're starting to refer to it as a positive good. This notion that slavery is a good thing and that it actually brings benefits to Southern society, benefits to whites, and oddly enough, benefits to slaves themselves. And you can see some examples of this argument here on the slide. These are some quotes from a man named George Fitzhugh, who was a large slave owner himself and one of the leading voices of this whole pro-slavery argument. And I recognize that the argument that he's making here is completely offensive, but I think it really gets at the heart of Southerners' defense of slavery and the very essence of this institution for them in many ways. He's trying to make the argument here that slavery is beneficial to slaves because it's providing a quote-unquote civilizing influence or a quote-unquote Christianizing influence. He's arguing that these are people who are not capable of caring for themselves, and so they need a master to provide that type of care. This is an argument that historians have referred to as paternalism. He's trying to make the argument that in a free labor society, that African Americans would not be able to compete and they would just die off. And then he goes on to make this weird argument that slaves are the freest people in the world. You know, really twisted argument. But he's claiming here that they're the freest people in the world because under slavery, all of their needs are provided for them. They have a place to live, they have clothing, they have food, they don't have to worry about any of these other aspects of life. Again, a very twisted argument here. I think in many ways this is, white masters kind of rationalizing their behavior to themselves and rationalizing and justifying this whole process of holding other people in bondage. And the whole premise of it rests on this assumption of Black inferiority. That is at the heart of all of this. These ideas become the key element of this whole pro-slavery propaganda. Men like George Fitzhugh, or the man that you see in this quote, John C. Calhoun, they're claiming that slavery is beneficial to Southern society. Calhoun here says, many in the South once believed that slavery was a moral and political evil. We see it now in its true light and regard it as the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. So slavery is the basis for freedom. But of course, he means freedom for white men, because slavery is guaranteeing those free white men a certain level of status and privilege. They're even going as far as to claim that slavery makes the South superior to the North. And I think this is a very good case of this notion that the best defense is a good offense. They're trying to defend slavery by attacking free labor, arguing that slavery is bringing all this benefits to Southern society, while free labor is creating chaos and upheaval in the North. Those mill owners up North are just exploiting their workers instead of providing for them the way that slave masters are. So again, a very paternalistic type of argument that they're using to try to defend this institution. So we start to see these new types of arguments being put forward. And then in addition to these economic and racial reasons for supporting slavery, white men are also going to support it because of the gender assumptions that it contains. Slaveholding society is a patriarchy. White men aren't just masters of their slaves, they're heads of households. Everyone in that household, slaves included, are their dependents. So as household heads, they rule over their wives and their children too. They have virtually total authority. So that's something that's going to appeal to all white men, rich, poor, slave owner, non-slave owner. This idea of being a master, of having that kind of control over all the people within their households, whether or not that household actually owns slaves. So whether or not whites own slaves themselves, they still tend to support slavery as an institution, and they profit and benefit from it in a variety of ways, whether they own slaves themselves directly or not.